Hello, hello. Today's episode is about nervous system regulation, which you might have heard of, and there might still be a little bit of mystery around that. Um, so, my plan is to give you an overview of the nervous system, what it actually is, what it does, talk about what nervous system dysregulation is, what it might look like, um, and then talk about how do we regulate our nervous system with the spoiler that, babe, you're already regulating your nervous system all the time. You just might not be doing it intentionally. Um, but yeah, I'll hopefully talk about some specific practices and kind of how to think about the process of like if you're dysregulated, picking and choosing, okay, what might support me? Um, and if I feel like it, I might go into the consequences of chronic nervous system regulation. I might just touch on it, I might deep dive, we'll see. Um, and it's funny because I would say I'm experiencing a little bit of nervous system dysregulation today. I have driven across the country from San Francisco to St. Louis, 5 days of driving. Four of those I drove alone. I'm now with my family for a week where I'm from, St. Louis, Missouri. And although it's great, I'm also seeing a bunch of family members. I'm going here, I'm going there. I'm having a very busy 3 day work week before I finish the drive to Asheville, where I'm making a short term move. Um, so that includes a bunch of clients, making content, filming 2 podcast episodes, including this one, facilitating a workshop. Like, it's a lot. Um, and, when you visit family, there's always stuff that comes up. So I'm also just someone who likes my alone time and my downtime, and I have not gotten that. So I can really feel in my body there's fatigue, there's sensitivity, there's a desire to just pull the blankets over me and cancel. um, and that little things when they're not like my contact, was really bothering me and couldn't find more. And I was really sensitive. Like it was irritating me way more than it would if I was regulated. And so that's just a little context of what it can look like if your nervous system is dysregulated. And I'll go into it more, but I think one thing I emphasize again and again in my work is that everything is a spectrum. So I ask you to bring that framework of you can be a little dysregulated and extreme nervous system regulation. Yeah, dysregulation, that can be like the big breaking down, the big struggles. So we'll get into all that, but I kind of wanted to just preface that with some honesty of like, oh, isn't it ironic that I'm recording this and I'm feeling a little dysregulated, which right now just looks like this sort of tenseness in my system, this fatigue, this sensitivity, and that those can be signs of dysregulation. Okay, so let's talk about the nervous system. We have many systems in our bodies, but I'd argue that the nervous system is the most important because it controls all the other systems. It is the system to rule all systems. So anything that's happening, it is directly or indirectly influenced or controlled by the nervous system, by the chain reactions of hormones, of chemicals, of essentially positive or negative feedback to tell your body to do more or less of certain things. All of that has at least a start or a role in the nervous system. And the big picture, like if I had to summarize the nervous system's role in one sentence, it's that the nervous system's responsibility is to essentially gather data from the outside world, from internal, make meaning, process it, catalog it, match it with predictions, and then tell our body what to do. Like, do we need to rest? Do we need to run? Do we need to slam on the brakes? Whatever it is. So our nervous system basically controls our body, controls our energy, controls our actions. Some of that being conscious, a lot of it being unconscious and automatic. So I'm going to explain how the nervous system is divided. If you don't want to know this, honestly, you can skip ahead. I'm going to go into a little bit of weeds, but know that actually most of it's like not totally relevant, but I want to give you a map because we're going to focus on one part of the map. So I want to give you the whole thing so you kind of understand. So broadly, the nervous system is 2 parts, but there's subcategories in several of these parts. So it's the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is your brain and spinal cord. And the brain is like the command center. it is arguably the most important. And the spinal cord is like the superhighway that sends information from the brain to the rest of the body. So, if someone was brain dead, they wouldn't live very long. If someone had a spinal cord injury, they can't feel, they don't have function below that point. So these are obviously very, very important. Um, and yet our nervous system is more than that. So yes, these parts are important, and you know, they're not the only parts, but obviously our brain is where a lot of big things happen. But the peripheral nervous system, everything else, that's basically all the nerves in our body that are not part of the brain, our spinal cord, which is actually a lot. And the peripheral nervous system, and think like periphery, central center of the body, most important parts, peripheral, everything else. So the peripheral nervous system has two parts in it. The somatic nervous system, and this is basically all the parts of the nervous system responsible for voluntary movements. So when I'm like, I'm gonna pick up this mug, uh, um, basically like think like muscular and skeletal movements, as well as a lot of sensory organs. But it's basically kind of a little bit more of the doing part. And the autonomic nervous system, this is primarily controlling involuntary functions. So think about your heart beating, your lungs breathing, digestion, secretion of various glands and hormones. These are all automatically controlled, which is really great, because if you had to think about your heart rate beating or your heart beating, you probably wouldn't live that long, because if you didn't think about it, oh, not great. So autonomic equals automatic. It's a little bit more nuanced than that, but kind of controlling the things that are always going, telling it to go faster, go slower, whatever. But the autonomic nervous system, which is what we're going to focus on today, has, again, two parts. So we're kind of subdividing and going deeper. And the autonomic nervous system has sympathetic, aka go, and parasympathetic, aka rest and digest. And these are kind of like yin and yang. They're kind of always in a dance, and they roughly have opposite functions. And we need both for homeostasis, for maintaining this balance. And before I fully go into that, in general, the cells in our nervous system are neurons, and they're responsible for sending signals, basically using electrical and chemical signals. So basically kind of transmitting energy and transmitting signals that then send it to other neurons, then send it to, glands to secrete hormones or whatever it is. And that it's really this process of, sending signals from one part of the body to the other, and that's setting off chain reactions that tells us to go or to rest or to pick up that cup or to slam the brakes or whatever it is. And there's different types of nerves or neurons. And there's more than two, but I'll kind of give you the two, which is some send signals from our body to our brain, and that's mainly parasympathetic, and some send signals from our brain to our body. And so that can be important to distinguish, because we have both, and what it really means is we can use our body to send signals to our brain. So I'm going to go more into the autonomic nervous system. If your head is spinning a little bit, just let everything I've said go, and we will now pretend that the autonomic nervous system is all that exists and it's all that you need to worry about. And if you don't fully get how it all fits together, that's okay. You don't need to. Okay, so you've probably heard of fight or flight. You've probably heard of rest and digest. I have complicated feelings about those terminologies because they imply a lot, and it's not exactly accurate, even though it also is. So let me break it down in a really high level way. Sympathetic, aka the one called fight or flight, is our body mobilizing energy. It's our body being flooded to some degree, could be a little bit, could be a lot, with energy, with glucose, with cortisol, with adrenaline, to basically help us go, do, act. And in a big case, in a big instance, this is like someone getting their child out of a burning car. They are going. There is nothing else. In a much smaller instance, it's your heart rate beating faster when you get a text saying, hey, we need to talk. But that's basically ways that our body is being prepared for action. And then, whether or not we use that energy, that's a whole nother story. But the sympathetic is basically this chain reaction in our body where we are flooded with chemicals and energy that tells our body, let's go. Parasympathetic is the opposite. So it's known as rest and digest, and it's basically when things slow down. So this happens to some degree during night, although if you use a tracker, a fitness tracker, and you are told you have high resting heart rate, maybe that you're not getting enough parasympathetic. Maybe you are slightly dysregulated. But basically, parasympathetic is the calming down, the slowing of heart rate, the slowing of breathing. And it's really where a lot of restorative things can happen in our body. So when we're in sympathetic, aka that go, we're breathing faster, our heart's beating faster. Like I mentioned, we're flooded with chemical or with hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. There's more glucose ready. To some degree, we're more focused. It's all a spectrum, so it's going to vary. But our body has this readiness, but what that also means is, our body's not digesting. It's not, we might not have to pee in those really intense situations. If we're really, really, really on the full end of sympathetic, like we're not able to do strategic thinking. We're gonna act, we're gonna do, but some strategy maybe isn't some long-term strategic thinking. We can make those quick decisions. Whereas parasympathetic, it's sort of like our body is making those investments in our long-term health. So we're doing the sort of cellular repair. We are digesting. Our full immune response is being nourished, not just our short term. It's kind of like we're replenishing the well of energy that we used. And so, you can think about it as kind of like a gas and a brake, and the sympathetic is the gas and the brake is the parasympathetic. And, these two are always dancing. Neither is good. Well, they're both good, but I'm saying neither is bad. That's what I meant to say. So to bring it to nervous system regulation, now that I gave you a bunch of context, nervous system regulation is the dance between the gas and the brake, between sympathetic and parasympathetic. So it's being able to have both with the right amount in the right situation, the appropriate situation, and being able to be activated and come down into calm. So nervous system regulation is not one state. It is not calm. It is not parasympathetic. Because if you were always calm, even when a burglar is coming into your house, I don't know, maybe that is a time to run or to fight back. I'm not going to make that judgment call, but there are times when we need sympathetic. So being regulated doesn't actually mean always calm, but it means that our nervous system state reflects the situation. And when a situation is done, we can calm down. And our bodies are always in flux. So, if we think about it as using the idea of homeostasis, which is kind of the best analogy is actually, what is the word? It's like the air conditioning control unit. It's set at a certain degree, but what it does, if it gets too hot, it turns on the AC. If it gets too cold, it stops. And so it's actually always in flux, but there's kind of like a range. And so it's being able to sort of move between these ranges. And so when we talk about dysregulation, in many ways, it's the opposite. And there's kind of a few aspects of it that I want to touch on. So commonly when people refer to dysregulated, they're talking about a moment of acute dysregulation, of There's kind of different phrases. So one phrase is called flooded, and it's just like you are flooded with stress, with anxiety. Like it's an overwhelm, and that's not bad. It happens. Sometimes there's a phrase called your lid is flipped, and it's sort of like, it's kind of just like a too much, and it's sort of like, whoop, I'm not, like, call me's not here. It's too intense, whatever's going on. Um, you know, dysregulation, yeah, it can be that response that you get when you get that text. Or last night I was texting with a dear human, and they were like, I have something I want to share and I feel scared to share it. And then they took 20 minutes to respond. And I knew that they were typing, but like I experienced more dysregulation. I had to do a lot of deep breathing, and I had to really tell myself, like, okay, whatever this human says, it's gonna be okay. Um, and so, yeah, often when we talk about dysregulation, we're talking about that acute moment of, ooh, there's a shift in the nervous system, and all of a sudden you go from being in somewhere on the spectrum of more calm, of more parasympathetic, to experiencing that sympathetic, more dominant state. The heart's beating faster. You're noticing the feeling of energy in your body, and maybe your body's saying, I want to do, but there's actually nothing to be done. Maybe you're trying to have a conversation. Um, but the literature talks about emotional dysregulation. And with that, it's specifically referring to essentially having really intense emotional responses in response to something that maybe should, quote unquote, be not warranting a big emotional response. And I already don't love this, but I want to describe kind of how the literature talks about it. So, many people can experience emotional dysregulation, or be more likely to experience it more often. And this includes folks who are struggling with anxiety, depression, folks who have ADHD and autism, folks who've experienced PTSD or complex PTSD. And, this is well documented in the literature, and it's, again, I don't want to imply like a morality if it's a bad thing, but some people, from whether it's their neurochemistry, their genes, their epigenetics, their lived experience, like they experience emotions more intensely. So, I can speak on behalf of my experiences having ADHD. Is folks with ADHD experience, yeah, it's basically emotions more intensely, specifically anything related to like rejection. It's called rejection sensitivity. Folks with, for example, anxious attachments struggle with those relational things. So like getting a text of like, I have something to share. So it can, there can be a variety of causes, but the common denominator is really the nervous system. And so independent of a diagnosis, or, a self-diagnosis, if you, for example, haven't slept well the night before, the research also shows that you're more likely to experience heightened emotions and more nervous system kind of fluctuation, more sensitivity, higher heart rate variability, all of that. And it can be also just like acute. So, for example, if you're like me and you've traveled across 5 states and you have a very busy work right now and you still travel to go and you have everyone wanting to see you and you're not getting enough downtime, yeah, your nervous system doesn't have that right balance between parasympathetic and sympathetic. And so your resting state is probably going to be a little bit more sympathetic, which means it's more likely to kind of flood or fill over or flip that lid where you're more dysregulated. So this isn't a deep dive into any of this literature, but it's more of a high level that there can be many reasons why someone can be more sensitive or more likely to experience intense emotions and what is called emotional dysregulation. The distinction, though, historically, this literature hasn't really connected to the actual nervous system. And so when we talk about nervous system dysregulation, we are much more talking about what's happening in the nervous system, which is really helpful because I frankly find it gaslighting to talk about emotions without talking about the body, because emotions happen in the body. They're not just in the mind. So when we talk about nervous system dysregulation, I'm really naming the somatic component. Yes, there is emotions, but there's also maybe like muscles feeling tense and holding energy, heart rate, breathing. Like there's a sensitivity and an irritability maybe in the system because it has a baseline amount of readiness because it is overly indexed on sympathetic. And so, okay, to kind of bring it back before we go forward. I was mentioning that the parasympathetic and sympathetic, we kind of want this dance and this balance between the two. And yet many of us have a kind of a baseline, a resting state, right? It's like, where is our thermometer set? Where's our nervous system thermometer set? And the interesting thing is in my work, people often come to me because they're like, okay, I can tell maybe I'm stressed, maybe I'm not processing emotions, I'm feeling stuck. And what happens is often for them, and frankly for most of us, is our nervous system baseline is in the sympathetic zone. So we're used to a certain level of activation. And guess what? If you really like to be caffeinated, congrats. That's sympathetic. And for many folks, it can actually not feel safe to feel parasympathetic and calm. And so in my work, I really help people spend more time in parasympathetic and be able to get there and kind of dance between the two. And then you grow your capacity to go back and forth. But what many folks maybe don't realize is that they are in that sympathetic as a default. And so they only consider it dysregulation when it's really big. But, if there are those sneaky signs, and for example, muscle tension is a big one. That's energy that the body is essentially holding. That's a sneaky example of sympathetic. Irritability, difficulty sleeping is a big one because guess what? You can't sleep if your body has go energy. So there can be lots of little signs, but it's a really personal journey figuring out how your body is speaking to you. And this is a whole thing I do with my body language lab program, is to help people kind of discover, how their body is communicating different states and what helps them shift. The next thing I want to talk about before I go into like the tangible ways to regulate your nervous system to really shift your autonomic state is the fact that you are always regulating your nervous system. My friend, you're actually an expert at it. You just might not be doing things that me as a somatic coach, Jaclyn Shea, would endorse, but let's be real. We learn from a young age how to regulate our nervous system. So again, I'm home. My mom is moving, so we're going through old photos, and there's the cutest photo, several photos, I should say, of me doing what was my preferred way to regulate my nervous system as a kid, sucking my thumb and rubbing my earlobe. And even better, sometimes being held by my mom or laying on her lap or whatever. Oh my gosh, a triple whammy. The earlobe was my comfort. My mom's earlobe, my earlobe, anyone's earlobe I could get my hands on, basically. And then sucking my thumb was also a comfort thing. And to do both at the same time, ooh, worked like a charm for me as a kid. So that's an example of me self-soothing. And it's really funny because now, a big part of my work is helping people use their bodies to regulate their emotions, to send signals of safety and calm, to calm down, to shift into that parasympathetic, and to do that over time and really shift your capacity to be more in parasympathetic. And so it's funny for me to see, wow, I always knew how to use my body to do that. Now, probably caused dental issues from sucking my thumb, but it really worked. So we do things every moment of the day that regulate our nervous system. When you drink coffee, you are up-regulating. You are increasing the activation, the readiness in your system. Coffee puts you into sympathetic. It's a low grade. It's not the running into a burning building, but it's a low grade sympathetic. When you smoke cigarettes, when you use any substance, you are changing your nervous system state. Up, down, both. Who knows? Depends on what you're doing. When you're exercising, you are putting yourself into a healthy, safe sympathetic that pumps all the energy and you get high off of it. And it can be really great. You can use up some of the energy in your body. Amazing. That's putting your body into sympathetic. When you take deep breaths, you're going into parasympathetic. When you cuddle with a loved one, oh my gosh, the best parasympathetic. When you're walking in nature. Now, if it's a, it could, that can be a mix because nature is really regulating, really calming. But if you're really pumping that heart rate, it's also sympathetic. So that can be a really beautiful way to help your body have both at the same time, actually. When you're doing things like scrolling on social media, in a way, you're putting yourself into like a fake, parasympathetic. You're kind of like lulling yourself, and yet there's still a level of activation. Um, so there's a lot of things like binge watching TV. It might feel calming, but it's not the full rest and digest as if you were meditating or as if you were talking on the couch with a loved one or as if you were doing yoga nidra, which by the way, yoga nidra is my favorite way to put yourself into parasympathetic and build that capacity. Um, what are other examples? Yeah, connection. Connection can really shift us into parasympathetic, and other people's nervous systems greatly influence us. So maybe there's people who, frankly, they're kind of anxious just like you, and it feels good to be at the same vibrational level. And then there's other people who are calming in a good way, and some that are calming in like a uncomfortable way. So there's so many dances that we do on a daily basis. Some of them consciously, some of them unconsciously. Sometimes we put ourselves back into sympathetic because we don't feel safe resting and digesting. So we pick that fight. We send that text. We make that comment because maybe that's more familiar. Um, Maybe that glass of wine you have at the end of the day is your attempt at getting into parasympathetic, your attempt at calming down. And unfortunately, maybe you haven't reviewed the literature, which suggests that unfortunately it disturbs your sleep. And sleep is the main time we are strongly in parasympathetic. And so it causes more anxiety, it causes more stress. So many of the strategies that we use, again, either intentionally or unintentionally, to regulate our nervous system, many of them work well in the moment, but have unintended consequences. So drugs and alcohol being a big one, yes, they can definitely shift your state quickly, and they might deplete your body. Often they increase the baseline level of stress, anxiety, and depression. Exercise can be really great, but if you are like overdoing it or you're doing it in a way that is disconnecting you from your body, it can just be a way to kind of want disassociate, but also keep yourself kind of at an activated level. Yeah, the Netflix, the scrolling, the ways that we can like lull ourselves into what might feel parasympathetic, but it's not the real rest. It's a distraction. And from a nervous system perspective, what's happening? Is our heart rate lowering? Is our breathing lowering? Maybe not. Maybe our thoughts quiet. Maybe we kind of get sucked into a loop. But this is why, again, it's what's actually happening at the nervous system level matters. But I just say all this just to really drive home that, like, you already know how to regulate your nervous system. And I'm sure you're doing things that work great. The morning walk with the dog, like, deciding to have a cup of tea. I'm sure there's things you're doing that are great. And I don't mean to shame you for any things that are bad or maladaptive coping mechanisms. I hate that. I hate it. But it's like, how do we build out our toolbox that we have the things that work really quickly, you know, like that glass of wine, like that Xanax. And we have things that work that don't have those negative effects, that don't have those rebound effects of making the dysregulation even bigger, which basically all substances do, unfortunately. And by using our body, we can really shift our capacity to spend more time in the parasympathetic. I don't think I mentioned this. And I have an episode number 4, the concept that changed my life, the vagus nerve, where I talk a little bit more in depth about the autonomic nervous system, because the parasympathetic actually has 2 branches, one which is more connection and one which is more shut down. And I think the biggest thing I want people to know about the vagus nerve, which is kind of the nerve that controls the parasympathetic nervous system, is that it's made up of those cells, those neurons, of fibers that send data from our body to our brain. And so we can really use our body to shift ourselves into parasympathetic, to send our mind signals of safety, of signals of connection. And then our mind turns off that sympathetic chain reaction. It says, hey, we don't need that cortisol. We don't need that adrenaline. We're good. And maybe some of you can think your way there. Anatomically, it's not really how it works. But some people have more of a capacity for that than others. But the way I see it is because those fibers are of the vagus nerve, of the parasympathetic or afferent, sending signals from the body to the brain, we need to use our body to regulate, to calm. So let's talk about regulating the nervous system. Finally got you here, had to tell you a lot. So there's kind of two broad categories, which is upregulating and downregulating. And so you might think about this if you're feeling really shut down, you're so lethargic, you've no energy. That's a little bit more of a kind of energy conservation state, and we might want to up the energy, build energy into the system, versus the challenge that a lot of us have is there's too much stress, there's too much activation. So we might want to down regulate. And you might think of like shifting gears on a car here as a visual. And, so the very real thing that happens is the more time we spend activated, then we also will probably spend more time really shut down. And it takes more energy to get us activated. And, so some people, it's like they're so stressed that then their body's just like, dude, I'm tired. Unless they're really stressed. And then they have that energy. And it's this like really kind of black and white binary thing. Doesn't happen to everyone. And some people, many doctors disagree that adrenal fatigue is not real. I'd say, if someone, for people who've really struggled with burnout, the lived experience is very real, whatever you call the diagnosis. And this is why orientation to the nervous system is more important, because it's just like, well, what's the state of my nervous system? How do I work with that? And I'll just say that the adrenals are part of the sympathetic nervous system of stimulating that adrenaline and cortisol, releasing it. Okay, so let's talk about this. Let's start with down regulating, with the caveat that, sometimes you do want to use the energy that's there, but we don't always have the time, space, and permission to do that. So often we do need to downregulate. So my favorite way, and the way that has already enough literature and growing every year, is deep breathing. So the one that's the broad category of breath work that's been studied the most, or maybe not studied the most, but shown most effective, is essentially lengthening your inhales and lengthening your exhales even longer with an open mouth sigh. So that what this looks like for me, which the exact number can vary, depends on your lung capacity. Inhaling for 4, exhaling for 6, maybe even 7, open mouth. Inhaling through nose, exhaling, open mouth. If you do that, even just a few, but for like 3 to 5 minutes, you will be calmer. Research has shown that this has slowed down respiratory rate over time, and more so compared to other types of breath work and compared to mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness meditation is great, but if we're actually talking about changing our autonomic nervous system, that's not what meditation does. That's okay. It does other things. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm saying maybe it's been sold as the end all be all, and I invite you to work with your body in other ways. So deep breathing, here's what's happening. It's slowing down our breath. It's slowing down our heart rate. We might be getting more CO2, but we're also probably releasing more. It's stimulating our vagus nerve. And all of this is sending signals that we're okay. We're safe. We can chill out. So if you do nothing else, but you incorporate 3 to 5 minutes of deep breathing a day, you will feel calmer, you will feel safer, and your body will slowly spend more and more time in rest and digest. So there's lots of different breathing practices. That type of essentially longer exhales to inhales, That's the one that's been shown to be most effective at shifting us into parasympathetic. Um, but I do encourage you to play with breath work, because there can be breath practices that are more upregulating, that kind of give you more energy. And so if you want more energy, try those. If you're struggling with anxiety, those aren't always the right one. And that's when we want to go for the calm ones. So breath is really powerful. Touch, self-touch, and touch with other humans. I teach all sorts of specific practices, but basically, put your hands on your heart, hold yourself, hug yourself. Touch is really the first way that we learn we're safe. And yet most of us don't get enough touch. So how can you literally hold yourself, tell your body, you're okay, you're all right. Hands on your heart is my go-to. I do that every single day. And guess what? You can do it with those deep breaths. And research shows hands on your heart reduces cortisol as measured in the saliva. Not quite as much, but similar to a hug. So it's really powerful. Obviously, if you can get touch from another, do it. I'm jealous. Get that. But even just self-touch can be so, so powerful. Yoga Nidra is another way to down regulate. And I do Yoga Nidra literally every day. I basically do about a 20 to 30 minute one in the afternoon, kind of after lunch. And I have a whole episode on Yoga Nidra, so go listen. It ends with a Yoga Nidra. Go do it. There's a bunch on YouTube. Honestly, go for it. So Yoga Nidra is essentially shifting you into sleep brainwaves, except you're awake. Some people do totally fall asleep. That's okay. Many people stay partially conscious and partially go into those deeper states of consciousness, those sleep states. And what happens during sleep? Well, our heart rate really slows. Our breathing really slows. Depending on how much that slows, we are either partially or fully in parasympathetic. And, there's tons of research on sleep, which really shows that that's when that cellular regeneration happens. That's when all the repairing, that's when we flush out toxins. That's when the juicy stuff happens. And yet most of us aren't sleeping well. And even if you are, your body can probably use more. And so Yoga Nidra is like a supercharged nap. I don't know about you, but I can't always nap, but I can't always do a Yoga Nidra. And the cool thing is my clients really say that, which I have some of them share their feedback in that Yoga Nidra episode, but say that Yoga Nidra over time makes them feel more and more calmer, and it really truly shifts their baseline into parasympathetic, slowly but surely. It's not always a quick fix. Like if you're anxious, I don't always think you should do Yoga Nidra because it's too chill. You kind of have to like work your way down. Again, the nuances of like how to decide what you need. This is what I cover in Body Language Lab. It's really a personal journey, and Body Language Lab is 14 weeks. This is not just kind of a one and done for most people. But Yoga Nidra is a thing that you do consistently. A lot of the studies, they only had them maybe do it twice or 3 times, maybe 4 times a week. So you don't have to do it every day. But one of the most impressive studies, it evaluated Yoga Nidra and oming, which is humming. It's very similar to humming, and that's a technique I teach people. But basically, they measured it at 3 and at 6 months of several times a week doing Yoga Nidra and oming, and there were significant and clinical reductions in blood pressure and high cholesterol, and an increase in good cholesterol. And that is a clear sign to me that the body is no longer at that elevated sympathetic state. We literally experience high blood pressure when we're acutely in sympathetic and stressed. And so, of course, if we are chronically, then yes, we will have high blood pressure. So for me, the data on Yoga Nidra is just so promising. Going to things like sound baths, that can be another beautiful way that, it's really shifting you into parasympathetic. Like I mentioned, time in nature, time with animals, Yeah, it's basically like how can you do an activity that's going to slow things down? Connection with others can be this, but it really depends on their nervous system. It really depends on your relationship. So I'm sure there's people that you can connect with that will activate you and not put you into parasympathetic. But when someone has a really strong nervous system that's anchored in parasympathetic, they will help pull you there. But if they are very strongly in sympathetic, ooh, they're gonna pull you there too. Not gonna be fun. Um, so those are a few of my kind of go-tos. There's so many though. EFT tapping can be powerful. And this is kind of like where you need to explore and experiment. And this is the whole theory of change behind Body Language Lab is I guide you on teaching you how they work and guiding you and da 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 and a whole video library. So you get to figure out what works for you. So that's a few related to shifting to parasympathetic. Um, and there's way more breathing practices. I just kind of named the one that for me works and that I've seen the most data on. Um, so as far as upregulating, so shifting from maybe less energy, from more like into having more energy. Yeah, well, this is actually a little bit more intuitive and easy. It's like this is why I have people get up and shake their body, just move, because we're often so sedentary, except for maybe working out. But it's like, how do you bring more energy into your body? And here's the catch-22 of both calming and energizing your body is you have to do it before you have the energy or before you feel that way. It's sort of like, oh, you want to feel calmer? Yeah, do a practice that will make you feel calm and then you'll feel calm. You can't think your way to it and then be like, well, now I'm calm enough to do breathing. And similarly, it's like you're sitting on the couch, you're like, oh, I don't have energy. Go work out, go dance, even just for 5 minutes. I'm not saying you need to do a whole 50-minute HIIT class. Move your body and it will get the energy moving. And it's sort of like your body's like, oh, we need to go. Okay, I'll go. I'll give you a little adrenaline. Let's do it, boo. So any type of dance or movement, and I really help. I encourage people to find like the impulse and find what movement feels right for them. But of course, a lot of people want to be guided early on, and that makes so much sense. Basically do another one is just lightly tapping on your body. And this is another one I teach in a variety of ways. There's ways that you can do it on Chinese medicine meridian points if you are into that, or you can just tap on your body and just kind of be like, hello, hello, aliveness. Let's get you moving. Let's get you moving. And that's a really beautiful way to just subtly increase the energy. This is where also the more activating breathing practices. So for calming, we want to focus on the exhales, lengthening those. For activating, for building energy, we want to focus on inhales, really maybe either longer inhales or more active. There's a big one, oh my, breath of fire, where you are basically the inhale is the more active one and the exhale just kind of happens. It's a very invigorating breath. If we think even about what we traditionally think of as breath work, it's a variety of practices that are inhale focused, and it's essentially you're over oxygenating your body and you're putting yourself into sympathetic. You're putting yourself into fight or flight with the purpose of sort of like moving what might be kind of stuck. I don't always recommend that. You really need a good teacher. If you were actively going through it, it could be supportive, but also you need enough resources. And it can really bring things up. So you need to be able to be supported in processing that. And so I often would prefer people work on building their capacity to be with difficult sensations and emotions and calm before you kind of put yourself in such an intense situation. But it can also be very, very, very powerful. Things like humming and singing, these are ones that can be both downregulating and calming and also get energy moving in a really subtle way. So upregulating and activating isn't always going into extreme fight or flight or extreme sympathetic. It can just be getting the energy moving when you're shut down or when you're in freeze. And so often that means more gentle, the gentle touch or tapping, the gentle humming or singing, doing breath work that's a little bit more active, but not totally a 45-minute breath work session. But basically it's like, how do I get more aliveness in my body? And again, that idea of if our body sends us signals, then we have to use our body, and then our brain will get there. And then the whole cascade of hormones and chemicals will happen. Um, let's see. Do. Anything else? I think those are my top ones. I don't want this episode to be too long. Um, yeah, and this is where I kind of want to bring it back into my theory of change with Body Language Lab, which is I teach you different concepts. I teach you different practices, most of which are based in science and evidence. Some are kind of like tangentially, it's like, well, that one's been studied, this one hasn't, but it's similar. And then, week by week, it's 14 weeks. We have 12 live sessions. You go on this kind of linear journey, and you have this whole huge video library that on your own you can say, oh gosh, I'm dysregulated. Let me try this practice. But over time, you're building your body's capacity to shift its state for you to notice, oh, whoa, I'm feeling tightness in my chest. Okay, let me try to hum. Oh, now I want to dance this through. Okay, now I want to do a yoga nidra. Now that it's moved through, I want to fully calm down. And that's what I love is what clients end up doing is combining practices. And they each do in their own unique way. And for some, they have different affinities, different ones that they really prefer for whatever reason. It doesn't matter. But you really figure out, one, your body's language and what practices work for you when you are really activated, when you are really shut down, when you didn't sleep well, when, all these different situations. So I can name these ones and you can try them and maybe they work great. But, maybe deep breathing isn't the one for every single situation. Maybe there's kind of a trio that you kind of use often. I don't know. But I think my theory is that you learn what works for you. And instead of it feeling prescriptive of like, well, I tried yoga nidra, Jaclyn, why didn't it work? You learn, oh, my body needs this. And maybe this one time it doesn't fully work. And I mean, that's okay because I can't force myself to be in a different state. But you try different things, you figure out what works for you, and over time, your nervous system spends more and more time in parasympathetic, and it becomes more obvious to you when you are dysregulated, when you are in that sympathetic, even in a more subtle way. And so then you slowly are like, ooh, whoa, I feel a little flooded. I feel that initial kind of dysregulation come on. I'm going to do these practices now instead of waiting till it gets really big like I used to. And then the house is on fire and you're trying to pour a bucket on it and, just only does what a bucket of water will do when a house is on fire. And so starting with the small fire and starting with a nervous system that is much more leaning toward parasympathetic, toward the rest and digest state. So, Body Language Lab might not be right for you right now, but that is kind of how I orient to it. And a lot of the experience of folks who've been in it. So I hope that you're walking away with maybe a better idea of your own nervous system, maybe some reflections on your own baseline, some realizations that you actually are good at regulating. And I hope no shame on maybe ways that you're doing it that are maybe have their negative consequences. I have my vices as well. And hopefully a few ideas of how to up-regulate, down-regulate. And the whole reason why I have all of those practices that are solo episodes and that I have folks do at the end of episodes is so that you can try them for free. If you never join any of my paid offerings, that's okay. I want you to have free resources. So try some of those. There's some really great ones that are episodes, so do those. And I really look forward to chatting again. If you're interested in Body Language Lab, it starts September 13th. Like I mentioned, it's 14 weeks, 12 sessions, different times. They're each an hour. Also a comprehensive video library. There's 30 videos now. I have more to record and I add to it all the time. Worksheets, journal prompts, short lessons, a Facebook group. So basically lots of different ways to be supported depending on your learning style. And if you're like a type A student who does all of it, you'll get a lot out of it. If you just do a little bit, you'll still get a lot out of it. That's how I've designed it. So hope to see you there. Again, start September 13th. If not, I look forward to connecting with you on the next podcast episode. Bye.